Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The Ellsberg paradox. An urn contains 90 balls, 30 of which are red, and 60 of which are some mix of black and yellow, but the exact proportions of black and yellow are unknown. The 60 non-red balls could be all black, all yellow, or any combination, and you are offered a series of bets, and the choices you face reveal a pattern of preferences that violates the standard axioms of rational decision theory. And this is the Ellsberg paradox, named after Daniel Ellsberg, who presented it in 1961. And the paradox demonstrates that people systematically prefer known probabilities to unknown probabilities, exhibiting what is called ambiguity aversion, a tendency to avoid situations where the probabilities are uncertain. And this preference pattern cannot be accommodated by expected utility theory, which requires that rational agents have well-defined subjective probabilities for all events and choose actions that maximize expected utility, calculated using these probabilities. The first bet involves choosing between two options. Bet A pays if a red ball is drawn, and bet B pays if a black ball is drawn. And most people prefer bet A, preferring to bet on red, where the probability is known to be 30 out of 90, 1/3, rather than betting on black, where the probability is unknown, could be anything from 0 to 60 out of 90. And this preference seems reasonable, seems to reflect a cautious attitude toward uncertainty, a desire to avoid ambiguity. The second bet offers a choice between bet C, which pays if a red or yellow ball is drawn, and bet D, which pays if a black or yellow ball is drawn, and most people prefer bet D, preferring to bet on black or yellow, where the combined probability is known to be 60 out of 90, 2/3, rather than betting on red or yellow, where the probability depends on the unknown proportion of yellow balls. The paradox emerges when these two preferences are combined, because preferring bet A to bet B suggests that the person believes red is more likely than black, that they implicitly assign a higher subjective probability to red, and preferring bet D to bet C suggests that they believe black or yellow is more likely than red or yellow, which implies that black is more likely than red. And these two beliefs are contradictory. If red is more likely than black, then red or yellow should be more likely than black or yellow, given that both involve adding the same unknown proportion of yellow. And so the preference pattern violates the sure thing principle, the axiom that if you prefer X to Y when some event E occurs, and you also prefer X to Y when E does not occur, then you should prefer X to Y unconditionally, regardless of whether you know whether E occurred. The Ellsberg paradox cannot be explained by standard subjective probability theory, because any consistent assignment of subjective probabilities to red, black, and yellow would make the preference for A over B incompatible with the preference for D over C. And so the pattern reveals that people do not have well-defined subjective probabilities for ambiguous events, or that they do not maximize expected utility using those probabilities, and instead they exhibit a preference for known over unknown probabilities, a violation of the completeness axiom of decision theory, which requires that agents must be able to compare all options and have a preference or be indifferent between them. Ellsberg's paradox has inspired alternative decision theories that can accommodate ambiguity aversion, including maximum expected utility theory, where agents consider multiple possible probability distributions consistent with their knowledge and choose the action that maximizes expected utility under the worst-case distribution, effectively being pessimistic about ambiguity, and Choquet expected utility theory, where probabilities are replaced with capacities that need not be additive, allowing for a richer representation of uncertainty, and multiple priors models, where agents maintain a set of probability distributions rather than a single prior and use decision rules that reflect their attitudes toward this multiplicity. The paradox also connects to debates about rationality and the normative status of decision-theoretic axioms. Some argue that the Ellsberg preferences are irrational, that they reflect cognitive biases or errors in reasoning, and that ideal rational agents would not exhibit ambiguity aversion, would assign consistent subjective probabilities and maximize expected utility, while others argue that ambiguity aversion is perfectly rational, that it reflects a reasonable response to ignorance, that known risks are genuinely different from unknown risks, and that the axioms of expected utility theory, while mathematically elegant, do not capture all aspects of rational decision-making. The paradox has practical implications for economics and finance, because ambiguity aversion affects how people make decisions under uncertainty, how they invest in markets where probabilities are unknown, how they value insurance and options, how they respond to new technologies with uncertain risks. And understanding ambiguity aversion helps explain behaviours that seem puzzling from a standard expected utility perspective, such as the home bias in portfolio choice, where investors prefer domestic assets over foreign assets even when expected returns are higher abroad, and the equity premium puzzle, where the observed returns on stocks are much higher than on bonds, suggesting that investors demand large premiums for bearing ambiguous risks. The urn sits on the table, 90 balls inside, 30 red and 60 mixed, and you must choose, and the choices seem reasonable, seem to reflect a natural caution about the unknown, but the pattern of choices violates the axioms of rational decision theory, reveals a preference structure that cannot be represented by subjective probabilities, and the paradox forces a choice: either accept that the preferences are irrational and should be corrected, or accept that the theory is incomplete and should be extended, and neither option is comfortable. Neither satisfies the desire for a simple unified theory of rational choice. And so the Ellsberg paradox remains, a challenge to orthodoxy, a puzzle that resists easy resolution, a demonstration that human decision-making is more complex than the elegant mathematics of expected utility suggests, and the ambiguity persists. The unknown proportions of black and yellow remain unknown, and we choose as we must, preferring the known to the unknown, preferring certainty to ambiguity, and the theory struggles to accommodate this preference, struggles to explain why it should be rational or how it can be consistent, and the paradox endures, unsolved, unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of decision theory. A reminder that rationality is contested, that formal models capture some aspects of decision-making but not all, and that the gap between theory and behaviour, between what axioms demand and what people do, may reflect not irrationality but the inadequacy of the axioms themselves. And the urn waits, the balls wait, the choice waits, and we must decide, knowing some probabilities but not others, and the decision reveals something about us, about how we value knowledge and fear ignorance, about whether ambiguity is just another form of risk or something fundamentally different. And the paradox lingers, unresolved, unsettled, a puzzle that decision theory has not yet tamed. The Chinese room argument, why understanding takes more than following rules. A philosopher sits alone in a room, and through a slot in the door come pieces of paper with Chinese characters written on them, and the philosopher does not understand Chinese, cannot read the characters, has no idea what they mean, but the philosopher has a rule book, an enormous book of instructions written in English that specifies for every possible input what output to produce, and the rules are purely syntactic. Say things like, if you receive these characters, then copy these other characters onto paper and send them out. And the philosopher follows the rules mechanically, receives Chinese input, looks up the appropriate response in the rulebook, writes the Chinese characters, and sends the paper out through the slot. And to outside observers who understand Chinese, the responses are perfect, are indistinguishable from responses a native Chinese speaker would give. The system appears to understand Chinese, appears to be conversing intelligently, and yet the philosopher inside understands nothing, is merely manipulating symbols according to formal rules. And this is John Searle's Chinese room argument, proposed in 1980 as a challenge to strong AI, to the claim that running the right program is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition, and the argument aims to show that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that symbol manipulation is not sufficient for meaning, that computers running programs are like the philosopher in the room, manipulating symbols without understanding what they mean. Imagine the situation from the philosopher's perspective, sitting with the rule book, receiving incomprehensible squiggles, looking up responses, writing more incomprehensible squiggles, and sending them out. And at no point does understanding occur, at no point do the symbols acquire meaning. The philosopher remains ignorant of Chinese throughout the process despite producing perfect Chinese responses. And Searle's point is that if the philosopher does not understand Chinese, then neither does any computer system that works the same way, that processes inputs according to formal rules to produce outputs. And since all computer programs work by manipulating symbols according to formal rules, no computer program can produce genuine understanding, can produce semantics, no matter how sophisticated the program, how large the rulebook, how perfect the response is. The argument is directed against the computational theory of mind, against the idea that cognition is computation, that thinking is symbol manipulation, that minds are programs running on brains. And Searle argues that this view is false, that minds have more than computational properties, that understanding requires something beyond syntax, something like intentionality, the capacity for thoughts to be about things, to have meaning, and intentionality is not a computational property, is not something that emerges from symbol manipulation. And so computers, which are purely computational systems, cannot have genuine understanding, cannot have genuine intelligence, no matter how complex their programs. Visualize the difference between a human understanding Chinese and the system of the room. The human has intentional states, has thoughts that are about things, knows what words mean, knows what is being said, while the room system has only syntax, has only formal symbol manipulation, and the symbols in the room are not about anything, do not mean anything to the system, are just meaningless marks manipulated according to rules. And Searle argues that this difference is fundamental, that no amount of syntactic processing can produce genuine semantics, cannot bridge the gap between meaningless symbols and meaningful thoughts. The Chinese room argument has generated enormous discussion and numerous objections. The system's reply argues that while the philosopher does not understand Chinese, the system as a whole, the philosopher plus the rulebook plus the room, does understand Chinese, and understanding is a property of the system, not of the components. And Searle responds that this misses the point, that even considering the entire system, there is nothing that understands Chinese. The system is still just manipulating symbols and internalizing the rulebook. Imagining the philosopher memorizes all the rules does not help. The philosopher still does not understand Chinese, still is just following rules. The robot reply argues that a computer embedded in a robot body, with sensors and actuators, with the ability to interact with the world, could ground symbols in experience, could connect symbols to things, and this grounding would provide semantics, would provide understanding. And Searle responds that this just adds more symbol manipulation. The robot receives perceptual inputs, processes them through programs, produces motor outputs, but all of this is still syntactic, still formal symbol manipulation, and adding perception and action does not add semantics, does not add understanding. The robot is just a Chinese room with cameras and arms. The brain simulator reply argues that if the program simulated the actual brain processes involved in understanding Chinese, neuron by neuron, then running the program would produce understanding, because understanding is what brains do, and the simulation reproduces what brains do. And Searle responds with the thought experiment of replacing neurons with silicon chips one by one, and asks whether, at some point, understanding suddenly disappears, and argues that if understanding depends on specific biological properties of neurons, then simulation is insufficient. And if understanding depends only on computational properties, then simulation has them and still does not produce understanding, showing that computation is not enough. The Other Minds reply argues that we attribute understanding to other humans based on their behavior, and if a computer produces the same behavior, we should attribute understanding to it by the same reasoning. And Searle responds that this is an epistemological point about how we know others understand, but his argument is a metaphysical point about what understanding is, and behaviorally equivalent systems might differ in whether they genuinely understand, and the Chinese room shows that behavioral equivalence does not guarantee understanding. Supporters of strong AI have largely rejected the Chinese room argument, have argued that Searle begs the question by assuming there is something more to understanding than syntactic processing, that he relies on intuitions about the philosopher's lack of understanding without justifying those intuitions, and that if the system perfectly duplicates the behavior of a Chinese understander, then it is a Chinese understander. An understanding is not a mysterious inner property, but is constituted by the right functional organization, the right pattern of information processing, and the Chinese room system has that organization. The argument also raises questions about what understanding is, what makes the difference between genuine and merely apparent understanding, and whether there could be a fact of the matter about whether a system understands or whether understanding is something we attribute based on pragmatic considerations. And Searle argues that understanding involves consciousness, involves subjective experience, involves intentionality, and these are biological phenomena that cannot be duplicated by computation, while functionalists argue that understanding is a matter of functional organization, and any system with the right organization understands regardless of its physical implementation. The philosopher sits in the room, manipulating Chinese characters, following rules, producing perfect responses, and understanding nothing, and the question remains whether this thought experiment refutes strong AI, whether it shows that computation is insufficient for understanding, or whether it merely trades on intuitions about the thought experiment that should not be trusted. And the Chinese room argument persists as one of the most influential arguments in philosophy of mind and AI, an argument that has shaped debates about consciousness, intentionality, and the nature of minds, an argument that continues to challenge the computational theory of mind. And the room remains. The philosopher remains, following rules, producing symbols, understanding nothing, and Searle's challenge endures, demanding explanation of how syntax could ever produce semantics, how symbol manipulation could ever produce meaning, and the argument stands as a permanent thorn in the side of strong AI, a thought experiment that forces advocates of computational theories to explain what their theories cannot easily explain, how understanding emerges from computation, how minds can be programs, and whether machines can think. The crocodile dilemma, when a monster's promise makes truth deadly. A crocodile seizes a child from the riverbank, snatches the infant in its jaws, and the mother screams and begs for her child's return, and the crocodile, cunning and cruel, makes an offer. The crocodile says, "I will return your child if you correctly predict what I will do, if you say truly whether I will return the child or not." And the mother must choose, must predict the crocodile's action, and if she predicts correctly, she gets her child back, and if she predicts incorrectly, the crocodile keeps the child. And this seems straightforward at first, seems like a gamble with 50-50 odds. But the mother is clever, thinks carefully, and realizes she can construct a prediction that creates a paradox. And she says to the crocodile, "You will not return my child." And now the crocodile faces an impossible choice, a logical trap from which there is no escape. And this is the crocodile dilemma, an ancient paradox from Greek and Roman philosophy that illustrates how self-reference and promises can generate contradictions that have no resolution. Imagine the crocodile processing the mother's prediction. She has said, "The crocodile will not return the child," and the crocodile must decide whether this prediction is true or false. And if the prediction is true, then the crocodile will not return the child. But the promise was to return the child. If the prediction is correct, and the prediction is correct, so the crocodile must return the child. But returning the child makes the prediction false, because the prediction said the child would not be returned. And if the prediction is false, then the crocodile is not obligated to return the child, but not returning the child makes the prediction true. And if it is true, the crocodile must return the child, and the cycle repeats. And the crocodile is stuck, unable to act, unable to fulfill the promise without violating it, unable to violate it without fulfilling it, and the paradox is complete. Visualize the crocodile frozen at the water's edge, jaws clamped around the child, mind caught in a logical loop, every option leading to contradiction, and the mother waits, and the crocodile cannot move forward or backward, cannot return the child or keep the child without creating impossibility. And the promise that seemed simple, seemed like a straightforward conditional, has become a trap, has revealed that some promises are unkeepable, some conditionals are incoherent when their conditions refer to their own fulfillment. The dilemma is structurally similar to the liar paradox, involves self-reference creating contradiction, because the mother's prediction refers to the crocodile's action, and the crocodile's action depends on whether the prediction is true, and the prediction's truth depends on the action. And this circular dependency creates a situation where no consistent assignment of truth values is possible, where any choice by the crocodile contradicts the conditions of the promise. And the paradox shows that not all promises can be kept, not all conditionals can be satisfied, especially when the condition refers to the action that depends on the condition. One proposed resolution is that the crocodile's promise is defective, is not a genuine promise, but a linguistic trick, because promises must be performable, must create obligations that can be fulfilled, and the crocodile's promise creates an obligation that cannot be fulfilled when the mother makes the strategic prediction, and so the promise is void. The crocodile is not bound by it, and the crocodile can do whatever it chooses without violating any obligation, and by this resolution, the crocodile keeps the child. The mother loses. Not because her prediction was wrong, but because she made a prediction that made the promise unenforceable, and the dilemma is resolved by rejecting the premise that the promise binds the crocodile in paradoxical cases. Another resolution distinguishes between the crocodile's intentions at the moment of making the promise and the actual outcome, and argues that the promise should be interpreted as concerning the crocodile's intended action, not the final action after considering the prediction. And when the mother predicts the child will not be returned, the crocodile evaluates whether to intend to return the child, and if the crocodile's initial intention is not to return the child, then the prediction is correct, and the crocodile should return the child according to the promise. And this return action does not create a contradiction, because the promise was about the intention, not about the final action. But this resolution seems strained, seems to reinterpret the promise in ways that were not clearly intended. And it is not obvious that distinguishing intention from action resolves the paradox or merely shifts it. A third resolution embraces the paradox and argues that it shows the limits of what can be promised, that some conditionals are inherently problematic, that promises whose conditions involve self-reference or depend on the promise's response to the condition create logical tangles that cannot be resolved, and rational agents should avoid making such promises, should recognize that not every grammatically well-formed conditional statement creates a genuine obligation, and the crocodile's mistake was offering a promise whose structure allowed paradoxical predictions. And once the paradox emerges, the crocodile is released from the promise, is in a situation where any action is permissible because no action can satisfy the promise, and morality and logic give no guidance. The crocodile dilemma also illustrates issues in game theory and strategic reasoning, because the mother is using her prediction strategically, choosing her words not to convey her genuine belief about what the crocodile will do, but to create a situation where the crocodile cannot win. And this strategic use of language, using predictions not to predict, but to constrain, appears in negotiations, legal arguments, and political discourse, where statements are crafted to create binds, to force opponents into positions where any response is disadvantageous, and the dilemma shows that self-referential statements can be weapons, can be used to trap others in paradoxes where no good option exists. The dilemma has modern variants involving computers and artificial intelligence, where programs might be given instructions that are self-referential, that depend on the program's own output in ways that create paradox, and programmers must be careful to avoid such loops, must ensure that conditionals do not refer to their own evaluation in ways that create infinite regress or contradiction. And the crocodile dilemma serves as a warning, a reminder that self-reference is dangerous, creates problems that cannot always be resolved by cleverness or by trying harder, but only by recognizing the structure and avoiding it. The child hangs in the crocodile's jaws. The mother waits for an answer, and the crocodile is paralyzed by logic, cannot move without contradiction, and the ancient paradox remains, unsolved, unresolvable, a trap that philosophy has not escaped, a reminder that language can create impossibilities, that promises can be unkeepable, that self-reference generates paradoxes that defy solution, and the crocodile dilemma endures, taught in logic classes, discussed in philosophy seminars, a vivid example of how words can bind more tightly than chains, how a simple promise can become an impossible obligation, and how the combination of self-reference and conditionality creates contradictions from which there is no escape, and the crocodile remains frozen, the child unclaimed, and the paradox persists, waiting at the riverbank for the next clever victim to spring the trap. The bystander effect. Why more witnesses mean less help. A woman screams in the street, attacked by an assailant, stabbed repeatedly over the course of 30 minutes. And dozens of neighbours hear the screams, look out their windows, witness the attack, and no one calls police, no one intervenes, no one helps, and the woman dies while witnesses watch. And this is the murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964, an event that shocked the public, that seemed to reveal something disturbing about urban indifference, about human nature, and psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané investigated, conducted experiments to understand why bystanders fail to help, and their research revealed the bystander effect, the paradoxical finding that the presence of other witnesses decreases the likelihood that any individual will help, that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely anyone is to intervene. And this contradicts common sense, which suggests that more witnesses mean more help, mean more potential helpers. But the psychological reality is opposite, is that responsibility diffuses across bystanders, that each assumes someone else will help. That pluralistic ignorance emerges where everyone looks to others to define the situation, and everyone concludes it must not be serious because no one else is acting, and the bystander effect reveals how social dynamics can produce collective inaction, can create situations where groups of people fail to help when any individual alone would help. And the effect has been replicated across hundreds of studies, has been demonstrated in contexts from emergencies to everyday helping, and understanding the bystander effect has practical implications for promoting helping behaviour, for overcoming diffusion of responsibility, for recognising that crowds do not guarantee help but often prevent it. Imagine witnessing an emergency. Someone collapses on the sidewalk, and you are alone, and your responsibility is clear, is unambiguous. There is no one else who could help. And so you help, you call for medical assistance, you check if the person is breathing, you do what you can, and the situation is straightforward. Responsibility is concentrated, is entirely yours. But now imagine the same situation in a crowded plaza. Dozens of people are present, all witness the collapse, and now responsibility is diffused, is distributed across all present, and you reason that someone else will help, that someone with more expertise will intervene, that surely someone has already called for help, and you look to others to see how they are reacting, and they are not panicking, are not rushing to help, and so you conclude perhaps the situation is not serious, perhaps the person is drunk rather than injured, perhaps help is not needed, and everyone reasons this way. Everyone diffuses responsibility, everyone looks to others and no one helps, and the person lies there untended while a crowd watches. And this is the bystander effect in action, the paradoxical result that more witnesses produce less help. The bystander effect demonstrates several psychological mechanisms: diffusion of responsibility, where the presence of others makes each individual feel less personally responsible; pluralistic ignorance, where everyone looks to others to define the situation, and everyone's inaction convinces everyone else that the situation is not serious; evaluation apprehension, where people fear being embarrassed if they help inappropriately, fear looking foolish if they misinterpret the situation; and audience inhibition, where the presence of others makes people self-conscious, makes them less willing to act. And these mechanisms combine to suppress helping behavior, to create barriers that are stronger when more people are present, and the effect is not universal, is moderated by various factors, by the ambiguity of the situation, by whether the victim and bystander are similar, by time pressure, by the relationship between bystanders, but the basic pattern is robust, is well established. More bystanders generally mean less help. Visualize the effect as an inverse relationship. As bystanders increase, helping probability decreases, and experiments show this quantitatively, show that when participants believe they are the only witness, they help more than 80% of the time. But when they believe there are 4 other witnesses, they help less than 40% of the time, and response time increases with number of bystanders. It takes longer to help when more are present, and these effects are not small, are not marginal, are dramatic reductions in helping behavior caused simply by the presence of others, and the effect challenges the assumption that safety in numbers applies to emergencies, shows that crowds can be dangerous not because they contain threats, but because they inhibit helping. One implication of the bystander effect is for personal safety, for recognizing that if you need help in an emergency, you should not appeal to groups, should not shout for someone to help, but should single out an individual, should point to a specific person and say, "You in the red shirt, call 911. And this direct assignment of responsibility overcomes diffusion, makes responsibility clear and concentrated, and significantly increases helping likelihood. And self-defense trainers teach this. Teach that calling for help requires specificity, requires breaking through the bystander effect by eliminating diffusion of responsibility. Another implication is for intervention training, for teaching people to recognize the bystander effect, to understand that their inaction contributes to collective inaction, that everyone assuming someone else will help means no one helps. An awareness of the effect increases helping behavior, increases intervention rates, and training programs that teach about the bystander effect and provide intervention skills show effectiveness, show that educated bystanders are more likely to help, are better at recognizing emergencies, are more willing to take responsibility, and many institutions now provide such training. Colleges offer bystander intervention programs. Workplaces train employees to intervene in harassment or discrimination, and understanding the psychology improves outcomes. The bystander effect also appears beyond emergencies, appears in everyday situations requiring minor helping, Someone drops papers and no one helps pick them up when many people are present. Someone struggles with a door and passers-by ignore them when others are around. And the effect generalizes, shows that diffusion of responsibility and pluralistic ignorance operate in low-stakes situations, not just in dramatic emergencies, and this suggests that the mechanisms are fundamental aspects of social psychology, are default responses to situations with potential helpers, and overcoming them requires conscious effort, requires recognizing the psychological barriers and deliberately choosing to help despite them. Some research questions the original Kitty Genovese narrative, suggests that the number of witnesses was exaggerated, that some witnesses did call police, that the story was sensationalized. And while the specific details are disputed, the bystander effect itself is real, is well documented, is not dependent on that one case, but is demonstrated across hundreds of experiments and real-world observations. And the effect remains one of the most robust findings in social psychology, remains a phenomenon that reliably occurs under controlled conditions. And questioning the Genovese case does not undermine the effect, does not invalidate the psychological mechanisms, but shows that public understanding of the case may be based on incomplete information. The effect also has limits, works differently in different cultures, is stronger in individualist cultures and weaker in collectivist cultures, where group responsibility is more salient, is stronger in urban environments, and weaker in small communities where people know each other, is weaker when victims are similar to bystanders, when group identity is salient. And these moderators show that the effect is not inevitable, is not universal, but depends on social context, on cultural norms, on relationships. And this suggests intervention strategies, suggests that building community, creating shared identity, emphasizing collective responsibility can reduce the bystander effect, can promote helping even in groups. The woman lies in the street, bleeding, screaming, and windows light up. Faces appear, watch, and no one comes, no one calls. The witnesses assume others will help, assume the situation must not be serious if no one else is acting, and the bystander effect unfolds, responsibility diffuses, pluralistic ignorance emerges, and the woman dies while a crowd watches. And the tragedy reveals something about human psychology, reveals that helping is not automatic, is inhibited by social dynamics, is suppressed when others are present, and the bystander effect remains one of the most important findings in social psychology, remains a demonstration that individual helping decreases when groups are present, that crowds can be obstacles to help rather than sources of help. And understanding the effect is crucial for promoting intervention, for overcoming diffusion of responsibility, for ensuring that witnesses become helpers rather than passive observers. And the effect endures as a permanent warning about the social psychology of helping, about the paradox that more potential helpers often mean less actual help. And the lesson persists that helping requires overcoming social barriers, requires taking personal responsibility, despite the presence of others, requires acting when everyone else is watching and waiting. The Banach-Tarski paradox. A solid sphere can be decomposed into a finite number of pieces, which can then be reassembled, using only rotations and translations, to form two solid spheres, each identical to the original. And this seems to violate conservation of volume, seems to create matter from nothing, seems to be impossible, and yet it is a theorem in mathematics, proven rigorously using the axiom of choice and the properties of infinite point sets. And this is the Banach-Tarski paradox, named after Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, who proved it in 1924. And the paradox reveals deep and counterintuitive features of infinite decompositions, of non-measurable sets, and of the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. The proof proceeds by decomposing the sphere into a finite number of pieces, typically 5 or 6, and each piece is a set of points, not a solid region with smooth boundaries but a scattered, disconnected, infinitely complex collection of points. And these pieces are non-measurable, meaning they do not have well-defined volumes in the usual sense. They cannot be assigned a size using standard measure theory. And this is crucial because measurable sets cannot be duplicated. Conservation of volume holds for measurable sets, but non-measurable sets escape this constraint. They can be rearranged in ways that seem to violate intuition, and the Banach-Tarski paradox exploits this by constructing pieces that are so pathological, so wildly scattered, that they can be rotated and translated to form two complete spheres. The decomposition uses the axiom of choice, the principle that given any collection of non-empty sets, there exists a way to choose one element from each set, and the axiom of choice is independent of the other axioms of set theory. It cannot be proven or disproven from the standard axioms, and some mathematicians reject it precisely because it leads to results, like the Banach-Tarski paradox, results that seem absurd, and rejecting the axiom of choice avoids the paradox. But it also cripples large parts of modern mathematics. Many important theorems depend on the axiom of choice, and most mathematicians accept it despite its counterintuitive consequences. The paradox applies only to objects in three-dimensional space, or higher. It does not work in 2 dimensions. A disk cannot be decomposed and reassembled into 2 disks. And this is because the group of rotations in the plane is amenable, meaning it admits a certain kind of averaging that prevents paradoxical decompositions, while the group of rotations in 3-dimensional space is non-amenable, and this non-amenability is what makes the Banach-Tarski paradox possible. The fact that rotations in 3 dimensions can be combined in ways that allow pieces to be moved around and duplicated. The paradox raises questions about the relationship between mathematical objects and physical objects, because while the Banach-Tarski theorem is mathematically rigorous, it does not imply that a physical sphere can be duplicated. The decomposition involves infinitely complex sets, pieces that are not solid regions but scattered collections of points, with no smooth boundaries, and such pieces cannot be physically realized, cannot be cut or manipulated, and so the paradox is a feature of mathematical idealizations rather than a claim about physical reality. And this distinction is important. The paradox shows that mathematical spheres treated as sets of points behave in strange ways, but it does not threaten conservation of mass or energy in physics, because physical objects are not sets of points but arrangements of atoms or fields or quantum states, and these are governed by physical laws that do not permit paradoxical duplication. Some mathematicians and philosophers argue that the Banach-Tarski paradox is not really a paradox but a theorem, a surprising result that reveals features of infinite point sets and non-measurable sets, and that calling it a paradox is misleading, suggesting contradiction when there is none, only counterintuitive behavior. And from this perspective, the paradox is valuable precisely because it challenges intuition, because it shows that infinite collections have properties that finite collections lack, that measure theory has limits, that the axiom of choice has strange consequences, and that mathematics is richer and stranger than naive expectations suggest. Others find the paradox troubling, a sign that something is wrong with the foundations, that the axiom of choice should be rejected or restricted, that non-measurable sets are pathological objects that should not be admitted into mathematics, and that theories which avoid such sets, like those based on constructive or intuitionistic logic, provide better foundations. And this debate reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of mathematical existence, about what kinds of objects mathematics should study, and about the role of intuition in guiding mathematical practice. The Banach-Tarski paradox also appears in discussions of probability and decision theory, because if a sphere can be decomposed into non-measurable pieces, then probability distributions on spheres must be carefully defined to avoid assigning probabilities to non-measurable sets. And this technical requirement reflects the same underlying issue, that not all collections of points can be measured, that probability requires measurability, and that attempting to assign probabilities to arbitrary sets leads to contradictions or paradoxes. The sphere sits on the table, solid and indivisible to the eye, but mathematically it is a set of infinitely many points. And the Banach-Tarski theorem says that these points can be partitioned into pieces, 5 or 6 strange scattered collections, and these pieces can be moved, rotated and translated and reassembled into 2 spheres, identical to the original, and the volume has doubled or seems to have doubled, but the pieces never had well-defined volumes. They were never measurable, and so nothing has been created, no conservation law has been violated, only the intuition that decomposition preserves size, and this intuition holds for finite decompositions, for measurable pieces, but fails for infinite non-measurable pieces, and the paradox endures. A theorem that sounds impossible, a result that challenges understanding, a demonstration that mathematics contains surprises, that infinity is stranger than imagination, that point sets behave in ways that solid objects do not, and that the axiom of choice, innocent as it seems, permits constructions that defy common sense, and the sphere duplicates, mathematically, if not physically. And the paradox remains, a permanent fixture in the landscape of mathematics, a result that students encounter with disbelief, that mathematicians accept as rigorous yet counterintuitive, and that philosophers debate as revealing something deep about the nature of mathematical objects, about the limits of measure theory, about the relationship between infinite idealization and finite reality. And the sphere sits there, unchanged and yet somehow doubled, a monument to the strangeness of infinity, to the power of the axiom of choice, and to the capacity of mathematics to prove truths that seem like impossibilities. The blind sight paradox. Why some blind people can see without seeing. A patient suffers damage to the primary visual cortex, the region of the brain that processes visual information and produces conscious visual experience, and the damage is severe, destroys the tissue completely, and the patient reports being blind, reports seeing nothing, experiencing only darkness in the affected visual field, and vision tests confirm the blindness. The patient cannot identify objects placed in the blind region, cannot read letters, cannot describe colours or shapes, and by every standard clinical measure, the patient has lost vision in that part of their visual field. And yet something strange occurs. Experimenters place objects in the blind field and ask the patient to guess where they are, to point at them even though the patient cannot see them, and the patient protests, says this is pointless, says there is nothing to see, but when forced to guess, the patient points accurately, reaches correctly, identifies the location, and sometimes even the nature of objects at levels far above chance. And this ability, this capacity to respond to visual information without conscious visual experience is called blind sight, and it creates a paradox. The patient is both blind and not blind, both lacks vision and has vision, lacks conscious sight but retains unconscious visual processing. And this dissociation between conscious experience and information processing challenges our understanding of perception, challenges the relationship between consciousness and function, and raises questions about what vision is, whether seeing requires awareness, whether perception requires experience. And this is the blind sight paradox, a phenomenon that reveals that consciousness can be separated from processing, that the brain can use information without the person experiencing it. Imagine the blind sight patient's perspective, looking straight ahead, and part of the visual field is normal, contains conscious visual experience, objects and colours and shapes, and another part is blank, is darkness, is absence of experience, and experimenters place an object in the blind region, a ball perhaps, and ask where it is, and the patient says, I don't know, I can't see anything there. And the experimenter says, just guess, point to where you think it is, and the patient reluctantly points, randomly it seems. And yet the pointing is accurate, is directed toward the ball, and the patient is surprised. says it was just a lucky guess, has no feeling of seeing, no visual experience that guided the response, and yet the accuracy persists trial after trial. And the paradox is that the patient is using visual information, is processing it, is responding to it, but is not conscious of it, is not experiencing it. And vision has split into two components: conscious experience and information processing. And these normally go together, but in blind sight they come apart. The blind sight phenomenon has been documented in multiple patients, studied extensively, and the mechanism involves intact pathways from the eye to brain regions outside the primary visual cortex. Pathways that process visual information for action and navigation without producing conscious experience. And these pathways allow blind sight patients to respond to visual stimuli without seeing them. And the existence of these pathways shows that vision is not a single unified process, but involves multiple systems, some conscious and some unconscious. And damage to visual cortex eliminates conscious vision, but leaves unconscious visual processing intact. And this dissociation reveals something fundamental about consciousness, shows that information processing is not sufficient for conscious experience, that the brain can process and use information without that information becoming conscious. Visualize vision as having multiple components. One component processes information for conscious perception, for seeing in the ordinary sense, for having visual experiences, and another component processes information for action, for guiding behavior, for spatial navigation. And normally these components work together, are integrated, and we do not notice the distinction. But in blind sight, they separate. One component is destroyed while the other remains, and the patient has action vision without perceptual vision, can use visual information for pointing and reaching, but cannot experience that information, cannot see it. And this shows that conscious experience is not simply a byproduct of information processing, but is a specific kind of processing, localized in specific brain regions. And when those regions are damaged, consciousness is lost even though other forms of visual processing continue. The blind sight paradox challenges functionalist theories of consciousness. Theories that say consciousness is defined by functional roles, by what information does, by how it affects behavior, because in blind sight, visual information performs many of its normal functions, guides behavior, enables responses, but does not produce conscious experience. And so consciousness is not identical to function, is something additional, is a specific kind of processing beyond mere responsiveness to stimuli. And this supports theories that distinguish between access consciousness, the availability of information for cognitive processes, and phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experiential quality. And blind sight shows that these can come apart, that information can be accessed and used without being phenomenally conscious. One response to the blind sight paradox accepts that it shows consciousness is separate from certain functions, from certain kinds of information processing, but argues that this does not threaten physicalism, does not show that consciousness is non-physical, only that it is a specific physical process localized in specific brain regions. And blind sight is a case where some visual processing continues without the processing that produces conscious experience, and this is compatible with consciousness being physical, being identical to certain patterns of neural activity. And the paradox shows which patterns are necessary for consciousness, shows that primary visual cortex is essential, and this is progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. Another response questions whether blind sight patients truly lack conscious experience, argues that they might have degraded or partial visual experiences that they do not recognize as vision, that do not match their expectations of what seeing should feel like. And when they say they see nothing, they mean they have no clear, vivid visual experience, but they might have vague feelings, subtle impressions that guide their guesses, and these impressions might be minimal forms of consciousness rather than pure unconscious processing. And this response denies the complete dissociation argues that some phenomenology remains in blind sight even if it is not ordinary visual phenomenology. A third response embraces the paradox as revealing that consciousness is not necessary for many cognitive functions, that unconscious processing is far more powerful than we thought, that the mind operates largely without awareness and consciousness is only the tip of the iceberg, a small subset of mental processes, and blind sight is an extreme case, but similar dissociations occur in normal cognition, where we process information, make decisions, guide behavior without conscious awareness. And the paradox shows that consciousness, rather than being essential to cognition, is a specialized feature that occurs only in certain conditions, for certain kinds of information processing. The blind sight paradox also has implications for debates about animal consciousness, about which animals are conscious, because if information processing without consciousness is possible in humans, then it might be the norm in simpler animals. Animals might respond to stimuli, navigate environments, exhibit complex behaviors without having conscious experiences, without there being anything it is like to be them. And this makes determining animal consciousness more difficult, makes behavioral evidence insufficient, because behavior can be produced by unconscious processing, as blind sight demonstrates. The patient sits in the laboratory, the blind field tested again and again, and each time the accuracy surprises, the pointing succeeds, the guessing is correct, and the patient insists they see nothing, feel nothing, experience nothing in that region, and yet the information is there, is being used, is guiding behavior, and the paradox persists. Vision without seeing, processing without experience, function without phenomenology, and the blind sight paradox remains one of the most important phenomena in consciousness research, a real-world demonstration that conscious experience and information processing can dissociate, that the brain can use information the person does not consciously access, and that consciousness is not reducible to function, is something specific, something localized, something that can be lost while other aspects of vision remain. And the phenomenon continues to challenge theories of consciousness, continues to provide evidence about the neural basis of awareness, and continues to raise questions about what consciousness is, what purposes it serves, why it exists, and whether it is necessary for cognition or is instead a luxury, an addition, something that happens only when certain brain regions process information in certain ways, and the blind sight patient reaches into darkness and touches the object, accurate despite seeing nothing, and the paradox endures. The boy or girl paradox. A family has 2 children, and you're told that at least one of them is a boy, and the question is posed, what is the probability that both children are boys? And the intuitive answer is 1/2, because the other child is either a boy or a girl with equal probability, but this reasoning is incorrect. The actual probability is 1/3. And this is the boy or girl paradox, a puzzle in conditional probability that has generated confusion and debate for decades, with different versions yielding different answers depending on exactly how the information is obtained and what assumptions are made about the selection process. The solution proceeds by considering all possible, equally likely combinations of 2 children. There are 4 possibilities: boy-boy, boy-girl, girl-boy, girl-girl, and girl-girl, where the order matters because the first child and second child are distinct, even if both are boys or both are girls. And if we are told that at least one child is a boy, then the girl-girl possibility is eliminated, leaving 3 equally likely cases: boy-boy, boy-girl, and girl-boy. And only in one of these 3 cases are both children boys, and so the probability is 1/3, not 1/2. The paradox arises because the conditioning statement, at least one is a boy, is not the same as knowing the gender of a specific child. If instead we are told that the older child is a boy, or the younger child is a boy, then the probability that both are boys becomes 1/2, because we are conditioning on a specific child being a boy rather than on the existential claim that at least one child somewhere in the family is a boy. And this distinction, subtle as it seems, makes a crucial difference to the probability calculation. The boy or girl paradox has many variations that probe the boundaries of the problem and reveal how sensitive the answer is to the exact specification of the scenario. One famous variant involves meeting a man who says he has 2 children, and one of them is a boy named Tuesday, meaning the boy was born on a Tuesday, and this additional information about the day of the week changes the probabilities in a surprising way, because it reduces the number of scenarios consistent with the statement, and the probability that both children are boys increases from 1/3 to 13/27. And this result seems bizarre, seems like the day of the week should be irrelevant, but the mathematics is sound. The additional specificity affects the conditional probabilities. Another variation asks, what if you meet a man with 2 children, and you see one of them, a boy? Does this change the answer? And the answer is yes. Seeing a specific boy is different from being told that at least one child is a boy, because seeing introduces selection effects. You are more likely to see a boy in families with 2 boys than in families with 1 boy, and so the probability calculation must account for the process by which the information was obtained, and different processes lead to different answers. And this sensitivity to selection effects is a general feature of conditional probability problems, and it explains why the boy or girl paradox has multiple defensible answers depending on the scenario. The paradox connects to the reference class problem and to debates about the principle of indifference, because applying the principle of indifference requires specifying a reference class, a set of equally likely outcomes, and different choices of reference class lead to different probability assignments. And in the boy or girl paradox, the reference class could be families with at least 1 boy, or it could be situations where someone tells you that at least one child is a boy. And these are different reference classes with different probabilities. And there is no neutral or obvious way to choose between them without more information about how the scenario is set up. The paradox also raises questions about the interpretation of probability statements in natural language, because phrases like "at least one is a boy" can be interpreted in different ways, as a statement about the existence of a boy in the family, as a statement about what someone knows or has observed, or as a statement about what information has been communicated, and each interpretation leads to different formal models and different probability calculations. And this ambiguity in natural language is a source of many probability paradoxes, where the mathematical answer depends on details that are not fully specified in the informal statement of the problem. Bayesian statisticians and frequentists also interpret the paradox differently. Bayesians treat probability as degrees of belief and calculate conditional probabilities using Bayes' theorem, while frequentists treat probability as long-run frequencies and may question whether the conditional probability is well defined without specifying a clear sampling procedure. And these different philosophical approaches to probability lead to different emphases in how the paradox is understood and resolved, though both traditions agree on the mathematical calculations once the problem is precisely formulated. The boy or girl paradox has practical analogues in genetics and medicine, where the probability of certain conditions depends on family history in ways that are similar to the structure of the paradox. For instance, the probability that a family carries a recessive genetic trait depends on how many children are observed to have the trait, and the calculations must account for ascertainment bias, the fact that families are more likely to come to medical attention if they have affected children, and this bias affects the probability assessments in ways that parallel the selection effects in the boy or girl paradox. The family walks down the street, 2 children beside them, and you know that at least one is a boy, and the question remains, what is the probability that both are boys? And the answer depends on how you came to know this fact, on whether you asked about a specific child or about any child, on whether you saw a boy or were merely told that at least one exists, and each variation of the scenario changes the answer, shifts the probabilities, reveals that conditional probability is sensitive to context, to process, to the mechanisms by which information is acquired and communicated, and the paradox persists as a puzzle, as a teaching tool, as a demonstration of how subtle probability can be, how carefully problems must be formulated, how easily intuition can mislead. And the boy walks ahead, evidence of his existence, shifting probabilities, conditioning beliefs, and the mathematics unfolds, precise and unforgiving, calculating 1/3 or 1/2 or 13/27, depending on the details, and the intuition struggles to keep up, struggles to grasp why the day of the week matters, why seeing is different from being told, why reference classes and selection effects have such profound impacts on what should be simple questions, and the paradox endures, unsettled in the sense that people continue to disagree about which answer is correct for which version, continue to debate whether the problem is well posed, continue to find new variations that test the boundaries of conditional probability, and the family continues walking. The boy or boys or boy and girl continue existing, and the question remains open, answerable only when the scenario is specified with enough precision to eliminate ambiguity, to fix the reference class, to determine the selection process, and until then, the paradox lives on. A reminder that probability is not just mathematics, but interpretation. Not just calculation, but careful attention to how information is obtained, how questions are asked, and how evidence is generated. The consequence argument, why the past makes your future inevitable. A philosopher constructs a deceptively simple argument about free will and determinism, an argument that has become one of the most influential and most discussed arguments in the free will debate. And the argument is called the consequence argument, formulated most clearly by Peter van Inwagen, and the argument aims to show that free will is incompatible with determinism, that if determinism is true, then no one has free will, that our actions are not genuinely up to us but are consequences of the past and the laws of nature, things we cannot control, and the argument proceeds through careful reasoning about what we can and cannot control, about what is and is not up to us, and it concludes that if the past and the laws determine everything, then we determine nothing. We have no control. We are not free. And this is the consequence argument, an argument for incompatibilism, for the view that determinism and free will cannot both be true, and the argument forces compatibilists to explain how we could be free if determinism is true, how our actions could be up to us if they are inevitable consequences of factors beyond our control, and the debate sparked by this argument continues, with philosophers proposing responses, defending premises, clarifying concepts, and the consequence argument remains central to contemporary discussions of free will, a challenge that every theory must address. Imagine the logical structure. Determinism says that the state of the world at any time, plus the laws of nature, entail the state of the world at all future times. Everything that happens is a consequence of what happened before, plus the laws. And now consider your action right now. Reading these words, and if determinism is true, then this action is entailed by the state of the world before you were born, plus the laws of nature, and you have no control over the state of the world before you were born. You did not cause it. You cannot change it. It is a fixed fact about the past, and you have no control over the laws of nature. You did not create them. You cannot alter them. They are what they are, independent of you. And if your action is entailed by things you have no control over, then you have no control over your action. And if you have no control over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this applies to all your actions. All are consequences of the past and the laws, things beyond your control. And so if determinism is true, then you are not free. You have no free will. And this is the consequence argument in its essential form. The argument can be stated more formally using the concept of power, what we have power over, what is up to us, And the argument says that no one has power over the past. No one has power over the laws of nature. No one has power over the fact that the past and the laws entail the present. And therefore, by a transfer principle, if the present is entailed by things we have no power over, then we have no power over the present. And having power over our actions is necessary for free will, and so we lack free will. If determinism is true, and the argument is valid, the conclusion follows from the premises. And so attacking the argument requires attacking one of the premises, requires either denying that we lack power over the past and laws, which seems implausible, or denying the transfer principle, denying that lack of power transfers across entailment. Visualize the causal chain, stretching back into the past, the state of the universe billions of years ago, plus the laws of physics, determined the state 1 second later, and that state, plus the laws determined the next state. And the chain continues, moment by moment, through the formation of galaxies and stars and planets, through the evolution of life, through human history, through your birth and upbringing and this present moment. And at no point in this chain did you have control. You were not there at the beginning. You did not set the initial conditions. You did not write the laws, and the entire chain was set in motion before you existed. And your current action is the end of this chain, is the inevitable consequence of factors you did not control. And the consequence argument says, this shows you are not free. Your action was not genuinely up to you, was determined by the past. Compatibilists respond to the consequence argument in various ways. One response denies the transfer principle, argues that lack of power does not transfer across entailment in the way the argument assumes, that you can have power over a fact even if that fact is entailed by other facts you have no power over. And this response requires specifying what power means, what it is to have something be up to you. And compatibilists argue that an action is up to you if it results from your deliberation, your desires, your character, even if those psychological states were themselves determined by the past. And so the transfer principle is false. Power does not transfer, and the consequence argument fails. Another compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle, but denies that we lack power over the past in the relevant sense, argues that we do have a kind of counterfactual power over the past. We have the power such that if we had chosen differently, then the past would have been different. And this counterfactual power is sufficient for freedom, sufficient for the action to be up to us. And critics respond that counterfactual power is not real power, that being such that if you acted differently, the past would have been different is not the same as being able to act differently. And the compatibilist response confuses conditional ability with genuine ability, confuses what would have happened if things were different with what you can make happen. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between freedom and ultimate responsibility, accepts that the consequence argument shows we lack ultimate responsibility, ultimate control, the kind of control that would make us solely and completely responsible for our actions independent of all prior causes, but argues that we have enough control, enough freedom, for moral responsibility, for being proper subjects of praise and blame. And ultimate responsibility is impossible, is not required for the ordinary kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the consequence argument shows too much, shows that even libertarians who reject determinism cannot have ultimate responsibility because their actions are either caused by prior states or are random, and neither causation nor randomness gives ultimate responsibility. And so, the consequence argument does not distinguish between compatibilism and libertarianism, does not favour incompatibilism over compatibilism. Incompatibilists defend the consequence argument, defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist responses involve sophisticated verbal tricks, redefine freedom in ways that evacuate it of meaning, and the consequence argument reveals that if determinism is true, then we are not truly in control, are not genuinely free, and moral responsibility is undermined. And we must either reject determinism or accept that free will is an illusion, and different incompatibilists choose differently. Some become libertarians and argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics or agent causation or emergent properties provide room for free will, and others become hard determinists and accept that free will does not exist, that responsibility is problematic, that praise and blame need reinterpretation. The consequence argument also generates discussions about the fixity of the past, about what it means to say we have no power over the past. Because in one sense this is obvious. We cannot change what has already happened, cannot make it the case that the past was different. But in another sense, our current actions do affect what the past was, because if we act differently now, then the past must have been different given determinism. And so there is a sense in which our actions constrain the past, and compatibilists exploit this to argue that we do have power over the past in the relevant sense, while incompatibilists insist that this is not real power, not the kind of control required for freedom. The argument stands at the centre of free will debates, forces clarification of concepts, forces philosophers to specify what freedom requires, what control means, what power involves, and whether these are compatible with determinism, and the debate is productive, generates insight, even if it does not generate consensus, and the consequence argument remains one of the most powerful arguments for incompatibilism. One of the most difficult challenges for compatibilists to answer, and Van Inwagen's formulation is elegant, is compelling, captures a deep intuition that if everything we do is the inevitable consequence of factors beyond our control, then we are not truly free and the past stretches back, determined and fixed, and the laws operate, inexorable and unchanging, and the present unfolds and the action occurs, and the consequence argument says, this action was not free, was not genuinely up to the agent, was a consequence of things beyond control, and whether this argument succeeds, whether compatibilists can answer it, remains disputed, remains central to contemporary philosophy of free will. The binding problem, how your brain unites what it processes separately. A neuroscientist examines how the brain processes visual information, discovers that different features of objects are processed in different brain regions, color is processed in one area, motion in another, shape in a third, orientation in a fourth, and all these features are analyzed separately, by specialized modules, by distinct populations of neurons. And yet when you look at a red ball moving to the right, you do not experience color, motion, and shape as separate. Do not see redness here and roundness there and rightward motion elsewhere, but see a unified object, a red round ball moving right, and all the features are bound together, are experienced as properties of a single thing. And this creates the binding problem, the puzzle of how the brain, which processes features separately, creates unified conscious experiences, how separate neural processes give rise to integrated perception, how the many become one. And this problem is fundamental, touches on the nature of consciousness, on how neural activity becomes experience, on what unifies experience into coherent wholes, and no complete solution exists. Various theories have been proposed, but the binding problem remains one of the deep mysteries of neuroscience, a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of consciousness. Imagine the visual system as a factory, with different departments processing different aspects of the product. One department handles color, another handles shape, another handles location, and all work in parallel, all process simultaneously, and each department produces its output color information, shape information, location information, and somehow these separate outputs must be combined, must be integrated into a unified representation, must be bound together so that you experience a red ball rather than redness and roundness as separate unlocalized features. And the binding problem asks how this combination occurs, what mechanism ensures that the right features are bound together, that the redness is attributed to the round object, and not to the square object that happens to be present in the scene. And this correct attribution, this accurate binding, is critical for coherent perception, for navigating the world successfully, and yet how the brain achieves it remains unclear. The binding problem has two aspects: the feature binding problem, which asks how different features of the same object are bound together, and the object binding problem, which asks how different objects are kept separate, are not confused with each other, and both aspects are challenging. Both reveal that perceptual unity is not given automatically by neural processing, but requires some mechanism, some process that groups features appropriately, and various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention has been suggested as a solution. The idea that attention binds features, that attended objects have their features integrated, while unattended objects do not. And this explains why feature binding errors occur when attention is diverted, why illusory conjunctions occur where features from different objects are misbound, are attributed incorrectly. Visualize attention as a spotlight that illuminates objects one at a time, and within the spotlight features are bound, are integrated, and outside the spotlight features remain separate, are not integrated, and this attentional binding theory has some support, has experimental evidence showing that feature binding requires attention, that without attention, features can be perceived separately without being bound correctly, and illusory conjunctions are more common under conditions of inattention, supporting the idea that attention is necessary for binding. But attention cannot be the complete solution, because some binding occurs pre-attentively. Some feature integration happens automatically before attention is applied, and so attention is part of the story, but not the whole story. Another proposed mechanism is temporal synchrony, the idea that neurons representing features of the same object fire in synchrony, fire together, and this synchrony is the binding code, is what marks features as belonging together and neurons representing different objects, fire at different times or with different phases, and this temporal separation keeps objects distinct, prevents their features from being bound together. And this synchrony theory has been influential, has generated extensive research, has led to discovery of synchronized neural oscillations in visual cortex, but the theory faces challenges. It is not clear that synchrony is sufficient for binding, it is not clear that consciousness depends on synchrony, and some experiments have failed to find the predicted correlations between synchrony and perceptual binding, and the theory remains controversial. A third approach argues that binding occurs through convergence, through hierarchical processing, where features are combined in higher-level areas, and early visual areas process features separately, but project to higher areas that represent combinations, that have neurons responding to specific conjunctions of features. And these conjunction neurons represent bound objects, represent integrated wholes, and binding is achieved through this hierarchical architecture, through neurons that explicitly encode feature combinations. And this approach has support from single neuron recordings showing that higher visual areas have neurons with complex selectivity, neurons that respond to specific combinations of shape and color and motion, and these neurons could be the neural basis of bound object representations. The binding problem also connects to consciousness, because unified conscious experience seems to require binding, seems to require that separate neural processes be integrated into coherent wholes, and some theories of consciousness, like integrated information theory, make integration central, argue that consciousness arises from integrated information, from systems where different parts interact and constrain each other, and binding as a form of integration is the combination of separately processed features into unified representations. And understanding binding may be crucial for understanding consciousness, may reveal how neural processes give rise to unified experience. The problem also has practical implications for understanding neurological conditions where binding fails, where patients see features but cannot bind them correctly, and such conditions exist. Barlint's syndrome is one example, where patients can see individual features but cannot perceive objects, cannot integrate features into wholes. And these patients provide evidence that binding is a genuine process, is not automatic, can be disrupted by brain damage. And studying these patients helps understand normal binding, helps identify the brain regions and processes necessary for feature integration. Some philosophers argue that the binding problem is really a problem about consciousness, about how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, about the hard problem. And binding is one aspect of this, is the problem of how separate neural processes give rise to unified conscious experiences. And solving the binding problem may require solving the hard problem, may require understanding how neural activity becomes experience. And this makes binding one of the deepest problems in neuroscience, a problem at the interface between neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The brain processes features separately, colour here, motion there, shape elsewhere, and yet you see unified objects, see red round balls moving, see integrated wholes, and how this integration occurs, how the separate processes give rise to unified experiences, remains one of the great unsolved problems. The binding problem stands, challenging, fundamental, revealing a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of perception. And various theories exist, various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention, synchrony, convergence, but no theory is complete. No theory explains all aspects of binding, and the problem persists as one of neuroscience's deepest mysteries. A puzzle about how unity emerges from multiplicity, how the brain binds what it processes separately, and the question remains open. The mechanism remains elusive, and the binding problem endures. The coastline paradox, why no one can agree how long Britain's shore is. A mapmaker sits down to measure the length of the coastline of Great Britain, the perimeter of the island, the total distance around its shores. And this seems like a straightforward task, a matter of careful measurement and calculation. But the paradox is that the answer depends on the scale of measurement, on how closely you look, on what size ruler you use to trace the coast. And as the ruler gets smaller, as the measurement becomes more precise, the measured length increases without bound, growing larger and larger, approaching infinity. And so the coastline has no well-defined length, or rather, its length is infinite. Or rather, the question of length becomes meaningless for highly irregular shapes. And this is the coastline paradox, first articulated clearly by mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, who used it to motivate the study of fractals, shapes that exhibit self-similarity and complexity at all scales. Imagine measuring the coastline with a 100-kilometre ruler, a straight stick 100 kilometres long, and you walk around the island placing the stick end to end, measuring each straight segment. And when you reach the starting point, you add up all the segments and get a total length, perhaps 4,000 kilometres, and this seems like a reasonable measurement. But now imagine using a 10-kilometre ruler instead, a shorter stick. And because the ruler is shorter, it can follow the bends and curves of the coast more closely. It does not cut across bays and headlands, but traces around them. And when you complete the circuit, the total length is longer, perhaps 5,000 kilometres, because the shorter ruler captures more detail, more twists and turns, that the longer ruler missed. And now imagine using a 1-kilometre ruler, even shorter, and it follows the coast even more closely, entering smaller inlets, tracing around individual rocks and peninsulas, and the measured length increases again, perhaps to 7,000 kilometres. Continue this process using shorter and shorter rulers, a 100-metre ruler, a 10-metre ruler, a 1-metre ruler, and each time the measured length increases, because each shorter ruler reveals new details, new irregularities, new ins and outs that the previous ruler smoothed over, and the coastline is fractal-like, exhibiting structure at every scale. Every time you zoom in, you find new complexity, new bays within bays, new peninsulas jutting from peninsulas. And so there is no scale at which the coast becomes smooth, no level of detail at which further refinement stops revealing new length. And if you continue to arbitrarily, small rulers, measuring every pebble, every grain of sand, every molecule, the measured length grows without limit, approaching infinity. And so the coastline paradox concludes that the coastline has infinite length, or more carefully, that the concept of length as traditionally defined does not apply to highly irregular curves like coastlines. Mandelbrot used this paradox to introduce fractals, geometric shapes characterized by self-similarity and non-integer dimension. And he showed that coastlines, along with many other natural shapes like clouds, mountains, rivers, and trees, are better described by fractal geometry than by traditional Euclidean geometry. And fractals have a property called fractal dimension, a number that quantifies how much space the shape fills. And for a smooth curve, the dimension is 1. For a surface, the dimension is 2. But for fractals, the dimension can be a non-integer, like 1.2 or 1.5, indicating that the shape is more than a line, but less than a surface. And coastlines typically have fractal dimensions between 1 and 2, reflecting their intricate, space-filling character. The paradox has practical implications for geography and cartography, because if coastline length depends on measurement scale, then different measurements will give different answers. And there is no single correct answer to the question, how long is the coastline of Great Britain? The answer depends on what resolution of map you use, on what level of detail you include, and different countries and agencies use different conventions, sometimes specifying a minimum feature size or a standard ruler length. But these conventions are arbitrary, and different conventions give different lengths. And so coastline length is not an intrinsic property of the coastline, but a relational property that depends on the measurement method. The paradox also raises philosophical questions about measurement and the nature of geometric properties, because it suggests that some shapes do not have well-defined lengths, that the concept of length, which works well for straight lines and smooth curves, breaks down for irregular shapes, and this is not a limitation of our measuring instruments, but a feature of the shapes themselves. And this raises the question of whether length is a fundamental property of all curves, or whether it is a concept that applies only to sufficiently regular curves. And fractals fall outside the domain where traditional geometric concepts apply. Visualize the coast as an infinitely jagged line, with bays and headlands at every scale. Zoom in on a section and you see smaller bays and headlands. Zoom in again and you see even smaller ones. And this pattern repeats forever. There is no smooth coastline at any level of magnification, only more and more detail, and so tracing the coast means following an infinitely intricate path, and the length of an infinitely intricate path is infinite. And this is the essence of the paradox, that complexity at all scales produces infinite length, that irregular shapes are fundamentally different from regular shapes, and that traditional geometry is inadequate to describe them. The coastline paradox also appears in other contexts, in measuring the length of borders between countries, in measuring the perimeter of cells or the surface area of lungs, both of which exhibit fractal-like structure with increasing detail at smaller scales. And in all these cases, the measured value depends on the scale of measurement, and there is no single correct answer, only a family of answers indexed by measurement resolution. And this multiplicity is not an error or a limitation, but a feature of the geometry, a reflection of the fact that irregular shapes do not have simple scalar properties like length or area in the traditional sense. The mapmaker gives up, unable to provide a single definitive number for the coastline length, or provides multiple numbers with caveats about measurement scale, and the coastline stretches around the island, infinitely detailed, infinitely long if measured with infinite precision, and the paradox remains a reminder that geometry is more complex than Euclid imagined, that natural shapes do not conform to circles and straight lines, that measurement depends on scale, and that some questions like how long is the coastline do not have simple answers, and Mandelbrot's fractals provide a framework for understanding this complexity, for describing and quantifying irregular shapes, and for recognizing that the world is full of structures that are neither one-dimensional nor two-dimensional, but somewhere in between. And the paradox endures, a touchstone in fractal geometry, a demonstration that infinity appears not just in abstract mathematics, but in concrete measurements of real physical objects, and the coastline remains, jagged and intricate, defying simple measurement, a natural fractal that reveals the limits of traditional geometry and the need for new mathematical tools to capture the complexity of the world. The diamond water paradox: why necessities are cheap and luxuries expensive. An economist observes that water is essential for life, is necessary for survival, is the most useful substance, and yet water is cheap, is almost free, costs nearly nothing in most places, while diamonds are useless for survival, are decorative luxuries, serve no biological function, and yet diamonds are expensive, cost fortunes, are among the most valuable commodities. And this seems paradoxical, seems to contradict the principle that value should reflect usefulness, that prices should correspond to importance. And this is the diamond water paradox, first discussed by Adam Smith, a puzzle about why necessities are cheap and luxuries expensive, why things essential for life have low prices while things irrelevant to survival have high prices. And the paradox challenged early economic thinking, challenged the labour theory of value, which said that prices reflect the amount of labour required to produce goods. And the paradox remained unresolved until marginal utility theory was developed, until economists realised that value depends not on total utility, but on marginal utility, not on the usefulness of the entire quantity available, but on the usefulness of one additional unit. And water has high total utility. Life depends on it, but low marginal utility because we have abundant water, and one more gallon provides little additional benefit, while diamonds have low total utility but high marginal utility because diamonds are scarce, and one more diamond provides significant additional satisfaction to those who value them. And this insight resolved the paradox, showed that prices reflect scarcity and marginal benefit rather than total importance. And the diamond water paradox became a teaching example, became the canonical illustration of the difference between total and marginal value. Imagine your situation regarding water. You have access to abundant water, can drink whenever you want, can shower, can water plants, and the first glass of water each day is enormously valuable, prevents dehydration, sustains life. But by the time you've consumed several gallons, the marginal value of additional water is nearly zero. Additional water provides almost no benefit, and since price reflects the value of the marginal unit, the value of one more gallon, and since that marginal value is nearly zero, price is nearly zero, is very low, and this explains why water is cheap despite being essential. Because the marginal unit is not very valuable, because we have so much water that additional water is worth little. And now consider diamonds. You probably have no diamonds or very few, and the first diamond you acquire has significant value, provides aesthetic pleasure, provides status, and since diamonds are scarce, since you have few or none, the marginal value of an additional diamond is high. And since price reflects marginal value, price is high. And this explains why diamonds are expensive despite being non-essential. Because the marginal unit is very valuable. Because diamonds are scarce and additional, diamonds provide significant benefit to those who value them. The diamond water paradox demonstrates the importance of distinguishing total utility from marginal utility, shows that these can diverge dramatically, that goods with high total utility can have low marginal utility, and vice versa. And this distinction is fundamental to microeconomics, is the basis for understanding consumer choice, for deriving demand curves, for analysing how people allocate scarce resources, and marginal thinking about the value of additional units rather than the value of entire categories, is essential for economic reasoning, and the paradox illustrates why marginal thinking matters, why it produces different conclusions than total thinking, and resolving the paradox required economists to shift from thinking about total value to thinking about marginal value, to recognize that prices are determined at the margin, by the last unit exchanged, not by the average or total units. Visualize the marginal utility curves for water and diamonds. The marginal utility of water is high for the first units, the first gallons that prevent dehydration, but declines rapidly as consumption increases, as basic needs are satisfied, and at the quantity consumed, the marginal utility is low, is near zero, and price equals this low marginal utility, while the marginal utility of diamonds is high even at low quantities, because diamonds are scarce, because even wealthy people have relatively few diamonds, and at the quantity consumed the marginal utility remains high, and price equals this high marginal utility. And this graphical representation makes the resolution clear, makes it visible that prices reflect marginal, not total utility, and the paradox dissolves once the distinction is understood. One implication of the diamond water paradox is about consumer surplus, the difference between what consumers would be willing to pay for all units and what they actually pay. And consumer surplus for water is enormous, is the difference between the life-saving value of the first units and the near-zero price paid, and consumers gain vastly more from water than they pay for it. While consumer surplus for diamonds is small, buyers pay prices close to their willingness to pay, and this shows that market prices do not reflect total value to consumers, do not capture the full benefit people receive, and the difference is consumer surplus is the unmeasured benefit. And understanding this helps explain why markets are beneficial, why trade creates value, because both buyers and sellers typically gain surplus, gain benefit beyond what they pay or receive. Another implication concerns necessity goods and luxury goods more generally. The paradox illustrates that necessities tend to be cheap, tend to have low prices relative to their importance, because necessities are typically abundant or because demand saturates quickly, because once basic needs are satisfied, marginal utility declines, while luxuries tend to be expensive, tend to have high prices relative to their importance, because luxuries are scarce or because demand does not saturate, because the wealthy always want more luxuries, and this pattern has implications for taxation. For understanding that taxing necessities is regressive, hits the poor harder, while taxing luxuries is progressive, hits the wealthy harder, and the paradox helps explain why economists typically advocate luxury taxes over necessity taxes, why sin taxes on non-essential goods are more acceptable than food taxes. The paradox also appears in discussions about water scarcity, because the resolution depends on water being abundant, depends on marginal utility being low, but in regions where water is scarce, the marginal utility of water rises dramatically, and prices should rise correspondingly, should reflect scarcity. And this suggests that in water-scarce regions, water should be expensive, should be priced to encourage conservation, to allocate scarce supplies efficiently, but such pricing is controversial, is seen as making a necessity unaffordable, and this creates political tension, creates conflict between economic efficiency, which requires high prices for scarce water, and social justice, which requires affordable water, and resolving this tension requires subsidies or tiered pricing or other interventions, and the paradox illuminates the trade-offs involved. Some argue that the diamond water paradox is not fully resolved, that even marginal utility theory leaves puzzles, because why do diamonds have high marginal utility? Why do people value diamonds? And the answer involves signaling, involves conspicuous consumption, involves diamonds serving as status symbols. And this is a different kind of value, is social rather than intrinsic. And understanding diamond value requires understanding social dynamics, understanding how luxuries signal wealth, how scarcity creates desirability, and this extends the resolution, shows that marginal utility can reflect social as well as physical properties, can reflect symbolic meaning as well as functional use. The paradox also connects to debates about labour theory of value, because Marx used labour theory, argued that value reflects socially necessary labour time, and the diamond water paradox is often seen as refuting labour theory, as showing that prices do not simply reflect labour inputs, because water requires little labour per gallon, but is essential, while diamonds require more labour but are luxury. But defenders of labour theory respond that the paradox misunderstands their theory, that labour theory concerns exchange value, not use value, concerns prices, not total utility, and that labour theory can accommodate the paradox by recognising that scarcity affects prices, that supply and demand matter, and this debate continues, shows that the paradox remains relevant for understanding competing theories of value. Water flows abundantly, is drunk freely, costs almost nothing, and diamonds sit in vaults, are purchased rarely, cost fortunes, and the paradox stands: necessity is cheap and luxury expensive. Total utility diverges from price, and the resolution comes through marginal thinking, through recognizing that prices reflect the value of additional units, not the value of all units, through understanding that scarcity matters, that abundance reduces marginal value, and the diamond water paradox endures as one of the classic examples in economics, as the teaching tool for introducing marginal utility, as the illustration of why economic thinking requires focusing on the margin, on incremental changes, on additional units, and the paradox remains, resolved but instructive, showing that value is context-dependent, is determined by scarcity and marginal benefit, and prices reflect the margin, not the total, and understanding this is fundamental to economic reasoning. The bootstrap paradox. There exists a strange loop in time where cause and effect chase each other in a circle, where information or objects appear from nowhere, with no origin, no creator, no beginning, and this is the bootstrap paradox, named after the impossible act of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, a paradox that emerges whenever time travel creates a causal loop that has no starting point. Imagine a time traveller who loves a particular symphony, and one day they decide to travel back in time to meet the composer, but when they arrive in the past, they discover that the composer has not yet written the symphony, and so the time traveller, eager to hear the music again, writes down the notes from memory and gives them to the composer, who then publishes it as their own work, and the symphony becomes famous, and years later the time traveller hears it and falls in love with it and decides to travel back in time to meet the composer, and the loop is complete. The question that haunts this scenario is simple and unanswerable. Who actually composed the symphony? The composer received it from the time traveller, and the time traveller received it from the composer, and neither of them created it. The information simply exists within the loop, passed from future to past and back again, with no point of origin, no moment of creation, no author. The bootstrap paradox differs from the grandfather paradox because it does not involve contradiction. The timeline is perfectly self-consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no clash between cause and effect, and yet something feels deeply wrong, an intuition that things must come from somewhere. That information cannot simply exist without being created. The paradox appears in many variations: a book that writes itself, a watch that is given to a younger version of oneself, who then keeps it for decades before giving it back, a technology that is brought from the future and used to invent itself, and in each case the object or information becomes eternal, trapped in a loop of time, aging perhaps, but never truly beginning or ending. Some physicists accept the bootstrap paradox as a genuine possibility if time travel is real, arguing that closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, are permitted by general relativity under certain conditions, and that such loops might allow for causally self-sufficient systems where the past and future are mutually dependent. Others find the paradox deeply troubling, a sign that something is wrong with our understanding of causation, entropy, or time itself, because information in a loop would violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases, that order does not arise spontaneously from disorder, and yet in a bootstrap loop, the information appears to be perfectly preserved, never degrading, never increasing in entropy, existing in a kind of timeless stasis. The many worlds interpretation offers one way out, suggesting that the time traveller who delivers the symphony creates a new branch of reality, and that in their original timeline, the symphony had a different origin, but this solution feels like cheating, multiplying universes to avoid the discomfort of the loop. The bootstrap paradox forces confrontation with deep questions about the nature of causation, whether causes must always precede effects, whether the universe permits closed causal loops, and whether existence itself requires an ultimate origin, or whether some things can simply be eternal and self-caused, through time without beginning or end, defying the intuition that everything must come from something, that there must always be a first cause, a prime mover, a starting point from which all else flows. The card paradox. Imagine a card, simple and rectangular, lying flat on a table, and on one side is written a single sentence. The statement on the other side of this card is true, and already the mind begins to sense danger, a trap being set. The card is flipped over, and on the reverse side another sentence appears. The statement on the other side of this card is false, and now the contradiction is complete. A perfect loop of mutual negation that cannot be resolved no matter how many times the card is turned. If the first side is true, then the second side must be true, as the first side claims, but if the second side is true, then the first side must be false, as the second side claims, which contradicts the assumption that the first side is true. And if the first side is false, then the second side must be false, as the first side incorrectly claims it is true. But if the second side is false, then the first side must be true, as the second side incorrectly claims it is false, and the cycle spirals endlessly without rest. The card paradox is a variation of the liar paradox, but its physical form makes the contradiction feel more tangible, more concrete, a paradox that can be held in the hand and turned over and over as if repetition might somehow reveal a hidden answer that logic cannot provide. The paradox demonstrates how self-reference can be distributed across multiple statements rather than contained in a single sentence, showing that contradictions do not need to be immediate or obvious to be genuine, that they can emerge from relationships between statements rather than from the statements themselves. Philip Jourdan, a mathematician and logician, is often credited with popularizing this version of the paradox in the early 20th century, using it to explore the limits of truth and reference, and to illustrate the kinds of problems that plagued attempts to formalize logic and mathematics during that era. The card paradox also reveals something about the nature of truth itself, the way that truth is not a property that statements possess in isolation, but a relationship between statements and the world, or between statements and other statements. And when those relationships form closed loops, the concept of truth begins to break down. Some philosophers argue that the statements on the card are neither true nor false, but meaningless, that they fail to refer to anything outside themselves, and therefore do not qualify as genuine propositions, while others suggest that the paradox exposes a flaw in the classical assumption that every statement must be either true or false, that perhaps some statements occupy a third category, undefined or indeterminate. The card sits on the table, innocent and menacing, a small object that contains an infinite problem, and no amount of flipping will resolve what is written on its surfaces. No clever interpretation will untangle the knot, and so it remains, a monument to the limits of language and logic, a reminder that not all questions have answers, that some truths are forever out of reach, caught in loops that reason cannot break. The Euthyphro dilemma. Is murder wrong? because God says so? Or does God say so because it's wrong? In ancient Athens, a young man named Euthyphro encounters Socrates on the steps of the courthouse, and Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for murder. And Socrates, ever curious, asks Euthyphro to explain what piety is. What makes an action holy or righteous? And Euthyphro confidently responds that pious actions are those loved by the gods, and impious actions are those hated by the gods. And Socrates, never satisfied with simple answers, poses a question that has echoed through philosophy and theology for over 2,000 years. He asks whether the gods love pious actions because those actions are pious, or whether actions are pious because the gods love them. And this question, now called the Euthyphro dilemma, presents a fundamental challenge to divine command theory. The view that morality depends on God's will, that actions are right or wrong because God commands or forbids them. And the dilemma forces a choice between two uncomfortable options, each with troubling implications for the relationship between God and morality. Imagine the first horn of the dilemma. Suppose that actions are good because God commands them, that rightness is simply whatever God says is right, and wrongness is whatever God forbids, and there is no independent standard of goodness, no morality that exists prior to or apart from God's commands. And God could have commanded anything, could have made murder obligatory and charity forbidden, could have declared torture virtuous and compassion wicked, and whatever God commanded would be right by definition. And this seems to make morality arbitrary, seems to empty moral terms of their content. Because if good just means commanded by God, then saying God commands what is good becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying God commands what God commands, which is trivial, tells us nothing, and more troublingly, this view seems to undermine the idea that God is good, because if goodness is defined by God's commands, then calling God good just means God does what God commands, which again is trivial, and we lose the ability to praise God's goodness as something meaningful, as something that transcends mere consistency with divine will. Visualize a world where this view is true, where morality is purely a matter of divine fiat, and God announces new commandments, declares that from now on, stealing is virtuous and honesty is sin, and according to divine command theory, this announcement would make stealing right and honesty wrong, because rightness just is whatever God says, and we would be obligated to become thieves, obligated to lie. And this seems absurd, seems to violate our deepest moral intuitions, because we feel that stealing and lying are wrong for reasons that have nothing to do with commands, that they harm people, violate trust, undermine cooperation, and these reasons would exist even if God commanded otherwise, and so morality seems to have a structure, a logic that cannot be altered by divine decree. And this suggests that the first horn of the dilemma is unacceptable, that we should reject the idea that actions are good merely because God commands them. Now consider the second horn. Suppose that God commands actions because those actions are good, that there is an independent standard of goodness, a moral truth that exists prior to God's commands. And God, being perfectly good and perfectly wise, recognizes this moral truth and commands accordingly. And God commands charity because charity is good, forbids murder because murder is bad, and the goodness and badness exist independently of the commands. And this seems more plausible, seems to preserve the meaningfulness of moral language and the praiseworthiness of God's goodness. But it creates a different problem, because if moral truth is independent of God, then God is not the ultimate source of morality. God does not create right and wrong, but merely recognizes and reveals them, and there is something above God, a standard of goodness to which even God is subject. And this seems to limit God's sovereignty, seems to place constraints on divine power and authority, and many theologians find this unacceptable, argue that nothing can be above God, that God is the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, and making morality independent of God seems to dethrone God, to reduce God to a mere messenger of moral truths that exist on their own. The dilemma presents a forced choice: either accept that morality is arbitrary, dependent on God's will, capable of being anything God decrees, or accept that morality is independent of God, existing prior to divine commands, limiting God's sovereignty. And neither option is attractive to believers who want to say both that God is the source of morality and that God's commands reflect genuine moral truth rather than arbitrary preference. And various theological and philosophical responses have been proposed over the centuries, attempting to escape between the horns to find a position that preserves both divine sovereignty and moral objectivity. One response associated with medieval theologians like Duns Scotus embraces the first horn, accepts that morality depends entirely on God's will, and bites the bullet on arbitrariness, arguing that God's commands are not arbitrary in any problematic sense because God is perfectly rational and benevolent. And while God could have commanded otherwise, God would never do so. And God's nature ensures that divine commands will align with what promotes flourishing and well-being. And so while morality is ultimately grounded in God's will, it is not random or capricious. And this response tries to have it both ways, tries to say that morality depends on God's will, but is still stable and reasonable because God's character is stable and reasonable. But critics argue that this just pushes the problem back, because now we are saying God's character is good. And what does good mean here? If goodness is defined by God's will, then saying God's character is good is circular. And if goodness is independent, then we are back on the second horn. Another response associated with Aquinas and natural law theory embraces the second horn but softens it, argues that moral truth is not independent of God but is part of God's nature, is rooted in the divine essence, and God's commands reflect God's eternal nature rather than arbitrary choices. And goodness is not external to God but internal, is what God is, and God commands what is good because God is goodness itself. And this unites God and morality, makes them inseparable, avoids both arbitrariness and external constraint. But critics argue that this is just wordplay, that if moral truth is part of God's nature, then it is still independent in the relevant sense, still not something God creates or controls, and the question remains whether God could have had a different nature. And if so, we are back to arbitrariness. And if not, then something constrains God's nature, something makes God's nature what it is, and we are back to external constraints. A third response from some modern philosophers rejects the dilemma entirely, argues that it presents a false choice, that it assumes moral realism, assumes that moral truths exist objectively, either dependent on God or independent, but perhaps moral truth is neither. Perhaps morality is a human construction, a set of norms we create to facilitate cooperation, and God's role is to guide this construction, to reveal which norms best serve human flourishing, and this avoids both horns by denying the assumption that moral truth exists in any absolute sense, but it creates new problems, makes morality relative or subjective, undermines the claim that moral truths are objective facts that God knows and humans can discover, and many find this solution worse than the original dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma appears not just in theology, but in secular ethics as well, because any attempt to ground morality in authority faces the same structure. If we say actions are right because society approves them, we can ask whether society approves them because they are right, or whether they are right because society approves them. And the dilemma recurs: arbitrariness on one side, independent moral truth on the other, and the same choice must be faced. And this suggests that the dilemma is not specifically about God, but about the relationship between authority and morality, about whether moral truth can be grounded in will, in decision, in command, or whether it must exist independently of any authority, answerable to reason or nature or some other source. Socrates stands on the courthouse steps, questioning Euthyphro, probing the foundations of piety, and the young man's confidence wavers His simple answer unravels, and the dilemma emerges, stark and unavoidable. And 25 centuries later, the question remains: does God command the good because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? And theologians and philosophers continue to debate, continue to propose solutions, continue to struggle with a choice that seems to force a sacrifice: either God's sovereignty or morality's objectivity, either divine authority or moral truth. And the dilemma persists, unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a challenge to anyone who wants to ground ethics in divine will, and a reminder that even the most fundamental questions about the source of right and wrong, about the relationship between God and goodness, about whether morality is created or discovered, remain open, remain contested. And the young Euthyphro walks away confused, and Socrates continues to question, and the dilemma remains, waiting to challenge every new generation of believers and philosophers who confront the ancient problem of how God and morality relate.